They were told America was a wasteland. They were told the American mongrels were too lazy to build a civilization and too cowardly to fight a real war. But on May 21st, 1945, 230 German prisoners of war stood on the deck of a transport ship, watched the Pacific fog vanish, and realized in a single, soul-crushing second that every word they had been fed for 12 years was a lie. They didn't see a ruin. They saw a bridge so massive, so impossible, and so effortlessly powerful that it didn't just end their war, it broke their world. Oberst Werner Richter sat in the dim light, a career artillery officer who had seen the Third Reich's invincible borders crumble from the Volga to the Rhine. He'd learned that in war, silence is a survival skill. He watched his men boys, like Hauser, a 19-year-old who had been captured before he could even fire his Panzer's main gun. Hauser still had the defiant posture of a soldier, but his eyes were hollow. They had all been raised on a steady diet of propaganda, that America was a nation of mongrels, a disorganized society that couldn't build a decent truck, let alone a civilization. They were waiting for the American reality to set in the starvation and the ruins they'd been promised. What Richter and his men were about to see wouldn't wound them with cruelty. It would wound them with something far harder to recover from. Clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives too late, wrapped in steel cable and international orange paint. If this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It genuinely helps us bring you more stories like this one. And we read every single word you write. The prisoners had been in American hands since March, taken during the collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. Since then, nothing had made sense. At their processing facility in Virginia, the lights stayed on all night. They were given 3 meals a day, real meat, white bread, and unrationed soap. Richter assumed it was theater, a calculated psychological trick to soften them up before the real treatment began. Even the guards were confusing. They didn't act like conquerors. They acted like bored commuters. One guard from Ohio showed Richter a photo of a neon-lit diner in his hometown. Richter handed it back without a word. He refused to believe a photograph. He was waiting for the truth. Then the ship's engines changed pitch. The vibration shifted from a deep sea-thrum to a cautious, low-speed crawl. The American guards didn't reach for their weapons. They reached for their cameras. A senior guard called out in careful, accented German, "All prisoners to the main deck. You need to see this." The Germans emerged from the dark hold into the biting, salt-edged air of a Pacific morning. A thick, suffocating fog hung over the water, hiding the coastline. For a full minute, there was only the sound of the hull slicing through the swell. Then the wind shifted. It tore the fog into long, horizontal strips, and through those gaps, a vertical mass began to emerge. At first, Richter saw only color a deep, rust-tinged red against the gray sky. Then, the scale resolved. 2 towers, symmetrical, rising out of the ocean itself, their peaks climbing above the fog line and into the open sun. Between them, suspended on cables as thick as ancient oaks, hung a roadway that spanned an inlet so wide it felt like a passage to another world. The Golden Gate Bridge, a sound moved through the prisoners like a physical wave. It wasn't a cheer, and it wasn't a cry. It was the collective, involuntary exhale of 230 men whose understanding of the possible had just been demolished. This bridge hadn't been built by a military. It had been built in 1937, during the height of the Great Depression, when German newspapers were telling everyone that America was starving and broken. It was a commuter crossing, a convenience for people driving to work. Hauser, the young panzer crewman, gripped the rail so hard his knuckles turned white. He had grown up in Dusseldorf, watching the Rhine bridges crack and fail. He had been told American infrastructure was slapdash and poorly built. Now, he was looking at 83,000 tons of steel, more than Germany's entire wartime allocation for 1944, hanging effortlessly in the air. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot standing near Richter said nothing at all. He had flown over England and France, filing reports about the endless columns of American trucks and the airfields that seemed to appear overnight. His commanders had told him his reports were inflated enemy propaganda. Now, standing in the shadow of a 746-foot tower, he realized he had been right all along. They all had. As the ship passed directly beneath the southern approach, Richter looked up. The underside of the roadway was a perfect, terrifying geometry of steel and rivets. It wasn't beautiful like a cathedral. It was beautiful like a mathematical proof. It was inevitable. It was correct. And in that moment, Richter didn't just realize they had lost the war. He realized they had never stood a chance. The ship continued its slow crawl into the bay, but for the men on deck, the journey was already over. Their world had ended right there, beneath a bridge they had been told couldn't exist. On May 21st, 1945, 30 miles off the California coast, the USAT General Amman cut through a heavy Pacific swell. Below deck, 230 German prisoners of war sat in a silence so thick it felt physical. They had been raised on a single, unwavering narrative that America was a decaying, mongrel nation, a land of shoddy craftsmanship and cowardice that would crumble under the weight of a real war. They expected to see a wasteland. Instead, as the fog began to tear, they saw something that didn't just end the war for them, it shattered their entire reality. Among them was Oberst Werner Richter, a career artillery officer who had seen the Third Reich's invincible borders collapse from the Volga to the Rhine. Beside him was Hauser, a 19-year-old panzer crewman, captured before he'd even fired a shot. They had been in American custody since March, but nothing had made sense. In Virginia, they were given white bread, hot water, and unrationed soap. Richter dismissed it as theater, a calculated show to soften them for interrogation. He was waiting for the real America to show its face. As the ship approached the coast, the engines changed pitch. The American guards didn't grab their rifles. They grabbed their cameras. A guard called out in accented German, "All prisoners to the main deck." "You need to see this." The Germans emerged into the biting, salt-edged air. A suffocating fog hid the coastline until a northwest wind tore it into long strips. Through the gaps, a vertical mass emerged, a deep, rust-tinged red against the gray sky. Then the scale resolved. Two towers, rising 746 feet out of the ocean itself, held a roadway suspended on cables as thick as ancient oaks. It was the Golden Gate Bridge. Richter heard a collective, involuntary exhale from his men. This wasn't a military fortress. It was a commuter crossing, built in 1937 during the Great Depression. Its two main cables contained 27,572 individual wires. Its 83,000 tons of steel represented more than Germany's entire wartime allocation for 1944. Hauser gripped the rail, his knuckles white. He had been told American infrastructure was now he was looking at evidence that everything he believed was a lie. A Luftwaffe pilot nearby said nothing. He had reported on the endless American supply lines for years, only to be told his data was enemy propaganda. Standing in the shadow of the bridge, he realized the truth was actually much worse. As the ship passed under the southern approach, San Francisco Bay opened before them. The city was a metropolis of glinting windows and dockside cranes working without pause. The bay was dense with cargo vessels, tugboats, and fishing boats, the commerce of a nation operating at full capacity on a Tuesday morning. Completely unconcerned with the war that had consumed Europe, Richter thought of the last winter on the Rhine, shells rationed 2-4 per gun, soldiers stripping coats from the dead, and officers burning documents for warmth. It had never been enough. In 1944 alone, the U.S. manufactured 96,318 aircraft. Germany produced fewer than 40,000 and couldn't fuel half of them. American shipyards launched a new Liberty vessel every 42 hours. U.S. oil production reached 1.7 billion barrels, while Germany refined just 33 million, less than 2% of its enemy's output. These weren't secrets. They were numbers visible in any trade report, but they had been ignored because they contradicted the narrative of German will. The buses that carried the prisoners away from the docks had padded seats and clean windows. Richter watched San Francisco pass by intact buildings, open shops, and children waiting at crosswalks. This city had sent hundreds of thousands of men to fight on two oceans simultaneously, and yet it looked like nothing had happened at all. The camp near Salinas was fair, but the real work was happening in the prisoners' minds. Hauser stopped laughing about American comfort after he found industrial journals in the camp library. He read production reports with the focus of a student who realized he'd been studying the wrong subject. The reconnaissance pilot went quiet in a way that would never be undone. Years later, Richter wrote a memoir. It wasn't about the Eastern Front or the fall of Berlin. It was about that single morning in May 1945. He wrote that the bridge didn't defeat Germany. Germany had defeated itself long before that, but the bridge was the moment the defeat became visible. It was the moment the mathematics stopped being abstract and became steel and concrete. To the Americans, the bridge was ordinary. That was the most devastating realization of all. It was a regional project built by a county authority with public bonds. For 230 German soldiers, it was the end of a 12-year story about destiny and strength. In the cold California light, the truth was total. They had never stood a chance against a nation that built the impossible as a matter of routine and then simply went back to work.